So what is amazing learning? So this is our goal, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about how we achieve this goal. Amazing learning is what happens when our learners surprise themselves and the teachers and the parents with the levels of learning that they've reached. So it's those moments in time where a child has a wow moment and achieves something that they didn't think was possible. And that may happen in the classroom, it may happen outside the classroom. And so our goal is to try and find opportunities and create the right environment in our school where our children can have these wow moments and can surprise themselves in their learning. But in order to get to that stage, we need to make a couple of fundamental shifts in our attitude and our focus. And that's what we've done here in Tembe Schools Penang and all our Tembe schools, all our ISP schools across the globe. So how do we achieve this? How do we get to that goal where students can have those wow moments? Well, the most important thing we need to do is we need to become a learning focused school. And that sounds like a cliche, but it means changing your approach and your attitude to all the decisions that you make in the school. And I'm going to touch on those a little bit later. So we begin by understanding where learning happens in schools. Now, quite often when we run workshops and we ask our parents where does learning happen, or we ask our community where learning happens, we get answers like in the classroom, through the homework, perhaps on the playground, but the answer that we're really looking for is in the brain. And why I say this is because in order to ensure that learning happens in schools, we really do need to understand what happens when children learn. And we're very fortunate because I think of all the fields of study over the last 15 years, neuroscience and looking at how people learn is probably the one area where we've developed the most knowledge. And so that helps us to refine what we do when we are in the classroom and when we are interacting with children. So we want our students to really understand what we mean by learning and what happens in the brain. And so in our international primary curriculum, the students will actually get a chance to follow a unit called the Brainwaves unit. And so they can talk quite comfortably about what happens in your brain when you learn. And we want them to understand that process and to be able to engage with what's happening in their brain. And so we say that learning is a brain change. And we want our students to understand that. So we want to understand that learning happens in the brain, but secondly, we also want to know, and we want our students to know, and our parents to know, what happens when someone learns. And so obviously there are a number of different ways in which the brain experiences new learning, but one of the ways in which the brain experiences new learning is through repeated experiences. And I love this photo because it actually explains those repeated experiences so well. So if you can imagine, if you walk along a field with tall grass and you've never walked along that field before, you will cross that path and you will walk that field. And if you don't return to that field, the grass will then grow and it will spring up again. But if you continue to walk along that path, and you walk the same path, then eventually the grass will flatten and you'll have a path. And that in the brain is what we call a repeated experience. So we know that learning happens through repeated experiences. Obviously, what we want is we want those repeated experiences to become hardwired. So we want them to have those continual repeated experience until they become hardwired, and what they're learning, whether it's a skill, becomes something that's embedded and something that becomes something that they can easily perform or they can master. So learning happens when people get better at something. But we obviously want that repeated experience to be a positive repeated experience. I'm sure you can all think of moments in your own childhood at school, I know I can, where you've had a repeated experience that perhaps has not been positive. And that repeated experience may be a experience of a particular subject or a particular activity that you've done at school. If that repeated experience is negative, then your perception for the rest of your life about that subject or about that activity is a negative one. And so although we are emphasizing repeated experiences, we want those repeated experiences to be positive ones. And that's extremely important in our classrooms, that learning is a positive repeated experience. And so we talk about stages of learning. And this is what we look at when we go into the classroom. And I'll come to that in a minute. So the first stage of learning that we look at when we are in our school is new learning. So that's when children are learning knowledge, skills, or developing understanding, and it's something which is new to them. We want them to be able to experience that in a positive environment. We want them to know that it's acceptable to make mistakes and take risks, and they're going to be in a good struggle at this stage. Now, what do we mean by a good struggle? Well, neuroscientists will sometimes call this productive struggle. What we mean by good struggle is we want to change that mindset that learning is easy. We want students to know that learning is hard. It's a good struggle. If there's a perception that learning is easy, then students will feel demotivated. Because if they try to learn something and it's not easy, then they will equate not being easy to them not being smart. And that's what we don't want students to do. We don't want them to think that, oh, because it's not easy, I'm not learning, and therefore I'm not smart. So being in a good struggle and experiencing new learning is extremely important. We then also go into classrooms and we sometimes see students consolidating their learning. That means they are practicing or refining or developing skills or knowledge or understanding that they've already acquired in another lesson. And that's quite often the case. For example, when the students are getting ready for an external exam, they might be consolidating some of their learning because they're getting ready to be assessed. And so we can come into a classroom and we can see students consolidating learning. And so these two elements at the top, good struggle and consolidating, we call those a positive experience in the classroom. What we don't want to see in a classroom is the two bottom stages of learning, which is treading water. This is when students are not in that good struggle or the productive struggle, as I mentioned before, because something is too easy. They're not being challenged, they're not being stretched, they're not being given opportunities to extend themselves. And so we really do want our students to avoid being in a treading water phase. And how we do that, I'll come to in a few more slides. And obviously the last thing that we want our students to be doing is what we call drowning. That's when they really are finding the work to be too tough. They don't feel supported, they're not engaged, they're demotivated, and that's when they will most likely experience that negative repeated experience. And as I said, I'm sure many of us can think of occasions in our life where we've had that negative repeated experience, because that mindset will stick for the rest of your life. And so we really do believe that learning means getting better. It's a brain change. As I've explained before, it occurs through repeated experiences, and we want our students to be in a good struggle, because we believe that good struggle equates to good learning. So just to summarize then, for us at Tenby Schools and for ISP, learning means having repeated experiences by which we hardwire. So if you think of that analogy of the field and someone walking across the field, you hardwire something, whether it's learning knowledge or developing a skill, as you would do in, for example, music or drama or PE lessons, or whether they're developing an understanding of a concept or applying something to real life. We want them to get better through good struggle.